All right.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here for the third of the four classes. Tonight we're talking about the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Stuart Hinds. I'm Babs O'Halloran, the programs director, but I'm so excited to be able to have Stuart here and talk and teach and give us info. So, all right, that's the title.
Thank you all so much for coming. As Bab said, my name is Stuart Hinds, and I serve as the curator of special collections and archives at the UMKC Library, which houses the Gay and Lesbian Archive of Mid-America, from which most of the stuff that we'll talk about came from. And tonight we'll talk about the 1980s. Last week we ended with the 70s, and we talked a lot about the number of different organizations that sort of bubbled up over time, over that decade. And by 1980, most of them were gone, all of them were gone, except for the Kansas City Women's Liberation Union, and it was a shadow of its former self. So it's a new decade, and with a new decade comes a new activist organization called GOAL, the Gay Organized Alliance for Liberation. It formed in 1980, and according to their promotional material, their purpose was to provide educational outreach to the public on the gay lifestyle in order to break down barriers and stereotypes that cause discrimination. And so they sponsored a speakers bureau, they did direct mail outreach, they did exhibits for conferences and conventions, they did media outreach, and they promised the development of courses and pamphlets on the gay community and gay concerns. In 1981, GOAL approached the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, which runs the public transit system, the buses. And what they wanted to do was place advertising signs on the inside of the bus. And the KCAC had a policy that banned ads that promoted political ideas and candidates, and so they refused these ads from GOAL as a result. And after refusing the ads, the agency then created a new policy that banned advertisements which may promote controversy. So GOAL reached out to the ACLU and they sued the ATA for violating GOAL's First Amendment rights. The case was in the courts through most of 1982, and in November of that year, the KCATA decided to settle with GOAL, and the ads made their way to the buses. But of course, this lawsuit and this whole situation drew a lot of media attention. And once the ads were placed in the buses, they were subject to a lot of vandalism and theft because of that publicity. So this is the iconic New York Times article that sort of introduced to the world the onset of a new disease that eventually became known as acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome is really not a disease. It is a classification. Because what happened was people were infected with what became known as the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. And when they were infected with HIV, that suppressed their immune system so that they were subject to any number of what were called opportunistic infections. Early on, the three major ones were pneumocystis pneumonia, which was a particularly brutal form of pneumonia, cytomegalovirus, which caused blindness, and Kaposi sarcoma, which was at the time thought to be a rare form of cancer. Now it's known to be a virus. And Kaposi's was the disease that caused lesions on the exterior of the body and the interior of the body. At this time, in the early years, if you had one of these three diseases, or if your immune cells got to such a low count, then you were classified as having AIDS. These diseases were hard enough on the body, but the suppressed immune system allowed for other kinds of secondary conditions to run rampant throughout the body. And in the early years of the health crisis, death came very swiftly. The most common visible aspect was wasting syndrome. They didn't figure this. It took science, medicine, a long time to figure this out. One of the reasons it took such a long time to figure this out was this man and his lack of interest in responding to this health crisis. He was elected on November 4th of 1980 and inaugurated, of course, just they all are, the following January. The first time he said AIDS in public was May of 1987, 6 years after he was inaugurated. By that point, 36,000 Americans had been diagnosed, almost 21,000 had died. And so this was the situation that we found ourselves in excuse me, the 1980s. And by the time that AIDS makes its way to Kansas City in 1982, we were in this environment that was spearheaded by Reagan and all of the people you just saw. In Kansas City, we never had the numbers that the larger cities on the coast had, like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. It really was just a matter of scale. The population here wasn't as big, and so the population that was affected by the crisis wasn't as big. The awareness, however, was just as fervent here as it was in the larger cities. The problem was it was much harder to get access to up-to-date information. We're in the Midwest, and lots more people are closeted, so there are other factors that were common to this part of the world that weren't quite as common on the coast, in the big coast, at the big cities on the coast. People's families would turn away from their children who got sick. It was a different experience here than it was in the larger cities. And because there was no federal government response, because there was no state government response, the first response that happened here came from the city. This was all along in our conversations, the Kansas City, Missouri Public Health Department has proven to be a surprisingly progressive department within the city. And so they started this project in 1983. They ran a hotline through the health department. They ran a support group. But the problem was, especially with anything that was started by an official organization, was that there was resistance from certain pockets of the community, because either they didn't feel like the community was being involved in the creation of such responses, or they felt that any money that was going to be spent on AIDS needed to go directly to people who were affected, not the infrastructure that needed to be set up to support people who were affected. So there was resistance to this project. It actually became Gay and Lesbian Health Services in 1984, and it's morphed over time, but it is still a department within, or a division within the health department. The first community response was the Good Samaritan Project, which was founded in September of '85 at the Metropolitan Community Church. At that point, it was located at 40th and Harrison. The church was immediately overwhelmed. Once the news got out about this, they were swamped. And so they knew they couldn't maintain this work and the work of the church. And so Good Samaritan separated from MCC the following February, about 6 months later. Good Samaritan offered both services, and they ran what they called Good Samaritan House, which was a hospice, which was located on Campbell, just south of Linwood, right over this way. Because especially in the early years, what happened was folks got sick, and so they couldn't work. So they lost their insurance. And because they couldn't work, they couldn't pay their rent or their mortgage. So they became homeless. So they needed a place to go to be taken care of. This hospice was one of the very few places where they could go. The first executive director of Good Samaritan Project was a woman named Virginia Allen, and she was the only paid employee for a very long time at the agency. It was a volunteer-run organization, and everything was run out of the basement of the hospice in the early years, which is just mind-boggling to me, because it's an agency that is dealing with people who are constantly in crisis, and there's this hospice above them. But the services that they offered were based on a program out of San Francisco called the Shanty Project. And it was basically peer support. Folks would go through training, and then they could be assigned to clients of the agency as buddies and help people do whatever they needed to do, their laundry, or to walk their dog, or to take folks to the doctor or to the pharmacy. The training itself was a very intensive 2.5-day experience involving guided meditation through the dying process, which was very traumatic for a lot of people. A lot of people used the training as an opportunity to come out, which sort of added to the drama and stress of the 2.5-day training. But GSP also ran a speakers bureau, did a lot of educational outreach, because again, you weren't getting this from the government, and so people were calling GSP saying, we need somebody to come to our corporation or our business and talk about AIDS. They got a big giant grant to start a nationally recognized teen hotline called Teens Tap, Teens Teaching AIDS Prevention, which is actually a really brilliant idea. The thinking being that teenagers would listen to and respond better to their peers. And so at the agency, they ran a 1-800 number, and they ran it in the hours after school so that kids could call and talk to teenagers and get confidential and accurate information about what was going on. Despite the good work of the Good Samaritan Project, in some pockets, there was a lot of resistance to what GSP was trying to do. This was a report that was issued by the local chapter of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But it details what they viewed as fiscal malfeasance on the part of GSP. And this was issued in December of 1988. And 1988 was a year of significant turmoil for the agency. They were much busier. In February of 87, they had 160 clients. By May of the next year, they had 493. And at this point, they're still primarily volunteer.
Can you say those numbers again?
160 in February of 87 and 493 in May of 88. But they did end up moving out of the basement of the hospice into this office space at 3940 Walnut. The building is still there. If you know where Clint's Comics is, this is right behind Clint's Comics. But besides the move, there were a number of other factors that converged in 88. The institution was constantly in crisis, both internally and from clients. There was no steady funding stream, and staff and volunteers were stretched to the breaking point because they had so much to do. And so in the summer of 88, Virginia announced that they were going to close Good Samaritan Project. The board of GSP had voted to close the house because, in their view, it was a matter of equitable distribution of resources. They were spending a lot of money on this house that only held 7 people, and they had all these other clients that needed served. And so it's a terrible choice to have to make, but that was the choice that was determined. Virginia herself was rather a brusque individual. Again, so the folks who were cranky about GSP just didn't gel very well with Virginia, and she didn't gel with them. And so this was taken very poorly in the community. It caused a huge panic, and it garnered a significant amount of bad press for the organization. So in stepped this woman, Sandy Berkeley, who was the wife of Mayor Richard Berkeley. She worked behind the scenes and found $100,000 in emergency funding to keep the house open for the next 2 to 3 months. She also was able to secure some Missouri legislative support for GSP, which sort of kind of opened the door to other fundraising opportunities for the organization. If they're getting that state money, then that says to other funders, oh, they've gotten the approval of the state, so it's safe for us to give money. In July of 88, Virginia Allen resigned. An interim director was selected who was one of her acolytes and just as brusque. So nothing really changed until in December, a new director was hired. And what he did was really start the transformation of Good Samaritan Project from this community-based grassroots organization to a professionally run nonprofit. And as part of that process, he hired a number of new staff, a development director, an education director, just all sorts of different folks, again, with some of that resistance. As part of the deal that Sandy Berkeley worked, it was required that the Good Samaritan House break away from Good Samaritan Project and be taken over by SAVE. SAVE was actually originally just a fund. The name is an acronym, Serving AIDS Victims Endowment. So when they became a bigger, more not normal, but typical organization once they took over the house. It was more than just an endowment. Successfully ran the house for a number of years, and SAVE is still around, and they have since expanded their approach to serving a wide variety of folks in need across different marginalized communities. Another group that got formed to do more educational outreach was the Condom Crusaders. Condom Crusaders was a group of folks who would go and do educational talks, but they made their greatest impact by going to gay bars on Friday and Saturday nights and handing out condoms, hence the name. They would explain why it was important to wear condoms, how to wear them effectively, and just try to get folks aware of safer sex practices. And of course, that's not an easy conversation to have, especially with somebody who's inebriated. So the manufacturers of the condoms would infuse the packaging with humor around the situation, just to sort of break that ice a little bit. And Condom Crusaders lasted from 1988 to about 1992. They were community funded with some assistance from grants that they wrote. Other organizations, other longstanding organizations in the city also got involved in the response to AIDS. The Ad Hoc Group Against Crime started a project called the Street Outreach Project Against AIDS. What else was going on in the 1980s was the crack epidemic. And so there were lots of drug houses in Kansas City, people doing intravenous drugs, which was another way to get HIV. So folks from Ad Hoc would actually go to these drug houses and educate people. And they also worked with sex workers and other individuals on the street. The Hispanic AIDS Coalition of Kansas City started in '89, and its work was eventually absorbed into the Guadalupe Center. All of these efforts, of course, require money and require funding. And so in the early years, especially, the community first turned to drag queens, because drag queens are very visibly good at making money, right? That's what they do. They're on stage and they're holding hands full of money. The drag community responded positively and favorably and participated in any number of efforts to do fundraising for these AIDS service organizations. So much so that in 1986, this troop formed. This was a group called the Kansas City Trollops, and they were formed to do nothing but do fundraisers for the AIDS service organizations. Clearly a comedic troupe, as you can tell by their outfits and their names: Malox, Virginia Hams, my favorite drag queen name ever, Sofonda Peters. They were at least weekly. They were doing shows at the bars around town, and their shows were raucous, and they didn't take themselves very seriously. And in my mind, they are sort of some of the unsung heroes of the AIDS crisis in Kansas City, because they lifted spirits as well as raised spirits as well as raising money during a particularly dark time. And their work was carried on by Flo, who I believe is still performing. She performed at the Cabaret, which was located in between 50th and 51st on Main Street, across from what is now CVS. You know where the CVS is, and there's Andres. This was there before Andres expanded. And Flo ended up raising over $500,000 in 10 years. And her money went to the American Foundation for AIDS Research. Of course, this was the primary fundraiser for the AIDS service organizations here. It was originally called Walk for Life. We know it better as AIDS Walk. It started in 1988, and in 1995, it became AIDS Walk, and we just had it a few weeks ago. It's always the fourth Saturday in April, and it almost always rains. You have all these fundraising efforts going on, and these different AIDS service organizations that have arisen in response to the crisis. Problem was that these service organizations didn't have a whole lot of time to focus on fundraising. They didn't have a whole lot of staff to focus on fundraising. And they were all going to the same places for funding. So some folks got together, and in 1992, they formed the AIDS Service Foundation, which still exists, AIDS Service Foundation of Greater Kansas City. And what the AIDS Service Foundation does is now they manage the AIDS Walk, but they also do other kinds of fundraisers and fundraising, and then each year split the money equally between the AIDS service organizations that are around. It was actually a very great idea because, especially in the rough years, that freed up staff to do the other things that needed to be done. So it was a very clever solution to a particularly challenging problem. Again, unrest in the community aimed at the AIDS service organizations who were perceived as not doing things the right way. Also, unrest with the way that the situation was not being handled by sources of authority, like the government. And so ACT UP, the national chapter, formed in 1987 in New York. Kansas City's chapter formed the next year in September of '88. In the early years, their protests followed examples of the New York chapter. So Kansas City is home to regional offices of different agencies of the federal government, lots of them, including the Food and Drug Administration. And so when the New York chapter led a protest of the FDA in Washington, D.C., the Kansas City chapter led a protest of the Kansas City office on the same day. They partnered with ACT UP of New York to protest at what was called a quack health conference in 1990 down at the Marriott. And that conference was set up to dispel alternative approaches, alternative treatments to AIDS. This was the medical establishment, and so they were trying to get people not to pursue these alternative treatments. And the folks in ACT UP felt that people could do whatever the hell they wanted, right? So they interrupted the conference. They did a surprise protest at the conference, and this is the way they were treated by the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department to break up that protest. And like the chapter in New York, the Kansas City chapter was pretty badass. They at a city council meeting where they were talking about a number of different issues, but some issues that were affecting the community, but some that were directly affecting the city's response to AIDS. One of the members of ACT UP had a couple of vials of blood that he spread around the doorway and the entrance into the city council chambers, for which he was arrested and charged. The charges were eventually dropped, but it was still a pretty badass way to make your point. And they did protests all over the city. This is one of my favorite protests. They protested at the National Convention of the Future Farmers of America, at which George Bush spoke. And so they showed up at the FFA convention and they got into it with members of the FFA. The kids were tearing up their signs and they were arguing on the street, and it just got a little bit ugly. But where ACT UP made its greatest impact, I would say, is in assisting people who had been fired, people who were either HIV positive or had AIDS and were fired from their job. Mark Sweetland worked for Telecheck, which back in the day when you wrote checks to stores, they would have to call and verify that your check was good, and Telecheck was the company that they called. So then they were based in Overland Park. Mark had been with Telecheck for a while, and in November of '86, he told his supervisors he had AIDS, and shortly after his disclosure, he was fired over the phone while he was in the hospital. Mark said that they thought I would end up paralyzing their business, and so he filed a complaint with the Kansas Commission on Civil Rights in '87. It took 2 years for the complaint to be dealt with, but it was determined that he was owed back pay and damages, and Telecheck appealed. And as part of the appeal process, in March of '89, members of ACT UP went and protested outside of the offices of Telecheck in Overland Park. Ultimately, Sweetland was awarded that back pay. A guy named Bill Hornberg had been a very successful manager for Payless Shoes. He had gone on vacation and came back, and he was fired without warning, without valid cause, or without disciplinary action because he had encountered a couple of some health issues. He'd had a couple of opportunistic infections, and he'd lost 70 pounds. So it was very visible on his person. Despite that, he continued to test negative for HIV. But he was fired simply because his boss believed that he had AIDS. He filed suit and subsequently reached out to ACT UP, and they followed the same pattern. They would issue press releases, and they would call for protests or do protests at the stores and call for boycotts. And a hairstylist named Lauren Atterby worked at a place called Beauty Unlimited, and this is in the little strip shopping area at 51st and Main, where Minsky's is located. This is at the south end of that shopping center. And he had been diagnosed as HIV positive after a bout of pneumonia. And when he contacted the owners to inform them of his diagnosis, they had a meeting in person 5 days later, at which he was fired. And the owners asked him to sign a statement that said he was voluntarily resigning. And he signed it, but later retracted it. Legal proceedings followed. Atterbury reached out to ACT UP, and they organized 2 protests at the salon, as well as a boycott and a phone campaign. This was not uncommon all across the country, right? People getting fired for being sick. And so not only did Kansas City and Kansas Cityans have to respond to this kind of bigotry, but we had our own unique brand of hatred as well, in the form of this individual. This is the Reverend Fred Phelps from the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka. And he gained notoriety initially for showing up with signs like this. He and his congregants, mostly his family, would show up with signs like this at the funerals of people who had passed from HIV/AIDS. In advance of them showing up, he would send faxes to the family, to the friends of the individual, and to the funeral home. These nasty faxes that announced that they were going to picket at the filthy AIDS dead fag, Charles Curry II. They did this all the time. And unfortunately, Phelps was not the only hostile party that ACT UP and the community had to react to as well. There was lots of fear and lots of angst in the mainstream community about this health situation. It was a really challenging time. First responders stated publicly that they were reluctant to do the jobs that they're paid for in zip codes where there might be a preponderance of people who might be HIV positive. Hospitals and doctors wouldn't take on people who were HIV positive or who had been diagnosed with AIDS because they didn't want to become known as the AIDS hospital, because their fear is that that would keep other customers away. And so it's this environment, both here and across the country, that led to the decision to take to the streets in Washington, D.C. in October of 1987, October 11th of 1987 specifically. A couple of local activists, Linda Wilson and Joan Maxwell, had brought back information about the march in the early spring of 87, and they were joined by a guy named Bill Todd, and they launched the Kansas City March on Washington Committee, and they spent the rest of the year promoting the event and fundraising for Kansas City demonstrators to participate. They met regularly at Phoenix Books on 39th Street, and they did things like, they sold buttons. It was actually a very lucrative approach. They sold lots of buttons. They did raffles and held other events throughout the city. And so those efforts resulted in the support of a group of more than 200 people marching behind the Kansas City banner in Washington, D.C. And they shouted chants like, "We're here because we're queer," "Gay rights now," 1, 2, 3, 4, "Reagan wants another war," 5, 6, 7, 8, "Reagan thinks his son is straight." And, you know, this was a huge march. This was about 500 to 600,000 people. And it had a profound effect on all of the participants, including those from Kansas City. One local marcher described the sense of community that they experienced at the march. "There is nothing I can say which can convey either the scope or the sense of family which was evident at the march, except to say that it was an event. But particular activities aside, just to be there and feel the incredible energy that blanketed the city and drew everyone together was more than I could have realistically hoped for. This was not a revolution, not some homosexual takeover. It was, rather, an assemblage of grassroots movements and concerned individuals who simply wanted to say that we are everywhere, to reaffirm a slogan we used all weekend: for love, for life, we're not going back. So it was a really powerful event. And all the folks who gathered in Washington went back home and they were fired up. That you see all sorts of different organizations forming in the months and the years after the '87 March on Washington, including in Kansas City. The Pink Triangle Political Coalition was formed in the fall of '87 by some of the March on Washington committee members and some other folks, and they officially incorporated in early '88. And what's interesting about Pink Triangle Political Coalition, they had a bunch of lawyers who were involved. So they actually spent a lot of their energy and a lot of their time looking at issues at the state level and trying to deal with a legislative approach to the problems that they were seeing and legislative solutions to those problems. In '88, Pink Triangle created a committee to organize and facilitate a pride activity. And after the '88 celebration, it became its own separate organization, GALA, the Gay and Lesbian Awareness. And GALA's focus was on reviving the local pride celebrations, because what had happened, people's energies were distracted in the early to mid '80s. There were still pride festivals, they just weren't as robust as they had been. And so that was GALA's work to revive and re-energize the pride celebrations. And in 1990, the celebrations, including a parade, which was the first that had happened since 1983. And so what we see then as the decade progresses is a number of these different organizations sort of coming together and joining forces. And Gay Talk, which we had talked about last week, the hotline that started in '75, actually incorporated as a nonprofit in '83. And in '88, they partnered with Condom Crusaders to become Gay Services Network. And then by '91, those two organizations partnered with GALA, and they became the Gay and Lesbian Services Network. It's just kind of a maturation of these activist organizations and these approaches to some of the issues that were going on. In 1989, some of those organizations and some others actually combined forces to combat the ongoing oppression that they found was still prevalent. And they led a big giant protest at City Hall. One of the results of these organizations joining forces is that you get bigger crowds, and it's easier to get media attention if you've got all these organizations participating. And that's exactly what happened at this protest at City Hall. And even our friends from ACT UP, which is astounding today to think about, they were able to get up to the observation deck of City Hall and drape their Stop AIDS banner over the edge of the observation deck, which of course would never happen now. This cooperation actually would prove to be instrumental in making greater change in Kansas City's queer community. The Human Rights Ordinance Project was formed in November of 1989. It was a grassroots coalition to support the passage of a civil rights ordinance in Kansas City, Missouri, that would prohibit discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations based on a person's sexual orientation or HIV status. And HROP was formed by actually a couple of members of ACT UP KC. We will talk more about that next week, much more about that next week, but I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, sir.
So, of course, the conference of concentration on the response to HIV/AIDS, and that's dominated by a lot of cis white guys. In the city, what was going on with women's movements or organizations of people of color during this time? How much of that in this collection?
The ad hoc group against crime was largely a Black organization, and so they were addressing that population, the population that I mentioned. There were some Black churches who were open to addressing, at a minimum, the existence of HIV/AIDS and trying to work in the ways that they could to address the issue in that community. As far as AIDS affecting different segments of the women's community, there's nothing in the collection that has reflected any sort of organization that was specifically aimed at women. What happened was in the queer community, the lesbian stepped up. Virginia Allen herself is a lesbian, and the lesbian stepped up and took a leading role in some of these organizations that were formed to meet the needs of the people who were afflicted. Yes, sir.
Once lawyers got involved with some of these organizations, based on your collections, from your interpretation as the archivist, did you see like more protections happening quicker for the queer community?
Not necessarily quicker, but more formalized, and more structured, because these people know how to navigate the law, and so they knew how to approach the problems in a very different way than some of these other community-based organizations that just had a wider range of backgrounds in their membership. See, that's because by doing it more formally, they leave a much larger paper trail. And so that's what's reflected in the collections in the archive, is that paper trail.
Very good.
So Trinity Lutheran, they were the first hospital to AIDS clinic in KC. That was along this line.
Trinity Lutheran, the first hospital to set up an AIDS clinic. I haven't seen evidence of that, and that's new to me. I will verify that. My recollection that St. Luke's, right over here, was one of the first to take patients, and Truman. So yeah, that's something I'd need to investigate.
No, that was a question. I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh,
I
okay.
was trying to ask.
Okay.
I saw something on the slide doctor at Trinity Lutheran.
Yeah. Okay. And that was part of the problem, is there were only a few doctors who were willing to see patients, and of course they were overwhelmed. Dr. Brewer at St. Luke's and some of the other physicians at Kansas City Free Health Clinic was another service organization that saw people. But there, especially in the early years, there were just a handful of individual physicians who would see patients.
Was it Dr. John Brewer at St. Luke's?
Oh Lord, I couldn't remember. I'm lucky to remember Brewer. I don't remember his first name. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this bakery health clinic, is that what eventually became KCAC?
Yes, because the Free Health Clinic started in the 70s as a counterculture alternative to the traditional medical establishment. Hippies started Kansas City Free Health Clinic, basically. Yeah.
If you want to know more about the community response to HIV/AIDS, particularly Kansas City PBS has produced a multi-part series that's available online with interviews and a lot of documentary information from GLAMA and other sources. So we encourage you to look into that if you can get on your own time. I'm trying to think of other resources related to this time.
One of which we'll talk about next week is another film that's on the GLAMA website that's called The Ordinance Project, and it looks at ACT UP and the onset of AIDS and the activism around that in Kansas City, and then how that morphed into getting this ordinance passed. And like I said, we'll speak to that much more next week. But the first half of the film is really about ACT UP KC. And before I forget, if you have more questions, please, but I will forget if I don't do it now. Please join us for a tour of GLAMA at Miller Nichols Library at 800 East 51st Street on July 19th, Saturday, July 19th at 2 o'clock. We pull a lot of the stuff that you've seen images of and just kind of walk through and look at the stuff, and you get to listen to me prattle on more about the actual stuff. This fall, starting on Sunday, September 14th, and for the next 10 consecutive Sundays, I'll be offering a Queer American History class. It's a formal class. There are no tests, there are no papers. It will also be on Sunday afternoons at the library from 2 to 4. To be honest, the school won't pay me to do it, and I have students who really want to learn it, so we're just doing it on Sunday afternoons. So we'll see how good the Chiefs do, and hopefully that won't affect our participation. But by next week, I should have all of this on a piece of paper that I can give you, so you don't have to worry about remembering it.
The final question. So you kind of know why I'm here, and I guess just to give context to folks here, I'm putting on a multi-generational queer cabaret that helps educate and entertain people about queer history in Kansas City and beyond. I am really making it a mission to make multi-generational synchronicity about this history. Because I've noticed younger queer people, myself included, have a bit of a disconnect about this time, I think due to the heaviness in a certain way. Our generation has kind of pandered to feel good and not really sit in who came before us to make us feel safe now. So my question is, what advice and or wisdom would you offer someone like me and younger generations to really understand about this time outside of this beautiful presentation that you gave? Is there a nugget of knowledge you would really bestow upon somebody?
Well, I think it's just like any history. There are different sources that are going to tell different stories, and you have to be a critical connoisseur of those sources and really go broad and deep if you can. And now, of course, there are films, and there are books, and there are documentary films, and feature films, and books, and all sorts of things. Granted, it's not easy because it's not even taught at the university.
I encourage you to turn to the arts, because the response of the arts captured the emotional resonance of that time period. I'm thinking of Angels of America and Harley Appliances and a number of films and plays which really don't shy away from the rawness of trying to navigate that period of history, where we were being doubly and triply negated and repressed. The thing that made me catch my breath was the film How to Survive. That socially, emotionally, artistically, politically resonated with such truth about this period. But I think if you didn't live through it, like some of us in the room did, preparing for it by looking at some art and some other documentary would prepare you for how true that is.
And it's interesting that you talk about a generational disconnect about this particularly dark time. I have found that men of my generation, people of my generation, especially men, gay men, don't talk about it. We never talk about it amongst ourselves because we all know. We all know what it was like. We all know how terrible and terribly challenging it was. It's kind of like how veterans don't talk about their experience. It's very similar to just that collective trauma. It's just not part of a conversation. I was working with a researcher who was looking at working on a book about queer healthcare before AIDS, and she said that every interview that she had with people who were involved in the AIDS crisis, wherever they were, they broke down. And I said, well, it's just not something that we commonly bring up. So there's that. In this particular instance, there's that layer as well. Again, to pitch the class, it will. I have offered this to the other classes that I have taught. Nobody's ever taken me up on it, and this time I'm just going to do it because it's a survey class, and so literally everything that we talk about, you can do a deep dive on. And so I will come up with resource lists for the various periods that we talk about that folks can walk away with, and then do more exploration on their own, because that's how you're going to learn more.
So let's say, for example, you can't come to the class because you work on Sundays. talking about me. Is there any way that I can access the resource?
I've been thinking about it in my head. What we'll probably do is we'll probably put it on the GLAMA website once I pull it together. Yeah.
One of my favorite websites.
Thank you. Well, we're getting ready to change it, so don't be shocked when it changes. For the good. Yeah.
That's what I assumed.
Yeah.
I'm like, how long is it going to be down for?
It won't be down for long, and knock wood, it'll be for the good. Yeah.
I wasn't here for the first presentation in the 60s. Sorry. But very kind of overwhelming and interesting to think about how much AIDS and HIV overwhelmed the 80s history.
Right.
of the gay liberation movement. So I just have kind of a question of what was some of the genesis that you saw or had observed for gay rights beginning in the 60s in Kansas City?
In Kansas City, in particular, it was sort of a coming together of a very active social scene, really active social scene, and the emergence in the 50s of what was called the homophile movement. So post World War II, it got really, really ugly. Lavender scare, people were being fired from the federal government, and so these organizations get formed on the coasts, and chapters get spread across the country. When the first meeting they ever had in person took place in Kansas City in 1966. And there was a local guy there, again, like the March on Washington, he got fired up and started an organization in Kansas City. And because they had access to a printing press, they became the information clearinghouse for this national movement. And so and it was, despite that, it was never a huge movement. The local organization was never very big, at most maybe 30 or 40 members. So the impact was much greater than the numbers would indicate. But that's kind of how it got started. That's kind of how the movement here got started. And then everything changed once the Stonewall happened, nationally and here.
And again, it was also becoming the political.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't there an exhibit online which tells more of this story that someone could visit on their own time?
There is an exhibit online. It's my teleprompter in the back, my living teleprompter. It's an exhibit called "Making History: Kansas City and the Rise of Gay Rights," and it's Google that and that'll get you to it.
The Tangent Group, they have a few articles from Mickey Ray. He wrote 2 articles. He was Drew Schaefer's partner who headed the Phoenix Society, which is the organization.
Yes, sir.
Specifically about the Reagan administration, so like gay rights, specifically during the Reagan administration, was there any particular group or any particular strategies that stood out to you to like combat all of this misinformation coming from the political spectrum and the White House?
Not from the White House. I mean, any sort of official response was going to come from the Democrats, who, like now, were out of power. Well, they actually held Congress Reagan's first term, but they were still overwhelmed by the massive shift in tenor of DC at the time, because with the election of Reagan comes this huge shift to the right. It affected everything, and they weren't going to bother themselves with this because it was the fags, and clearly the fags deserved it. And so it took until the end of the decade before there was any serious money committed to the federal medical establishment to do the things that needed to be done, and that in large part was spurred on by the folks in ACT UP.
Well, what I was asking is who combated next? So something like
I think in terms of direct medical solutions, yeah, that would be ACT UP, because there, as How to Survive a Plague shows, there was a subcommittee in ACT UP that literally shifted the way that the federal government approved drugs, new drugs. Anthony Fauci was involved in that process. As far as direct response, I'd say that was probably one of the most significant, if not the most significant.
But remember, this was pre-cell phones, pre-internet, pre-everything, and a lot of people chose at that time to be very visible socially and professionally and religiously in ways that have not happened at that scale in American society before. And that choice to be unapologetically visible also resonated and encouraged politicians to take more action because they saw the community bullwhip by the base, which was hopefully a change. Recently, I don't know. But it was supported by the overwhelming sense among a lot of the communities that were addressed by activism and continue to be by the Antichrist. When people just choosing to be seen and to be heard. And when truth is clamoring for visibility and has to stream longer, it can be effective. And I don't think we've seen anything different. Contemporary situation, more clamoring.
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to second that. So, like, it's a very good documentary. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's really, really worth seeing. And quite honestly, as Christopher said, films from the period are really, really powerful because they really give you a sense of what it was like. Parting Glances, Longtime Companion are two of the best known. And because what happened too in the early 90s was this queer new wave cinema. And so a lot of the storylines then are incorporating characters who are HOA positive or have AIDS or whatever. So there's a rich selection of both feature films and documentaries about this period. I don't know. I don't know. I can't remember. Oh, Early Frost. Yeah.
It's rather melodramatic. It was a hallmark emotional quality.
Right.
For the time, I mean, I had a friend respond to me at that film. It was the only conversation we were ever able to have.
Right. So next time, please join us because we'll talk more about, we'll move into the 90s and particularly the first half of the decade is just dense with all sorts of new activism, in part spurred on by the continuing and ongoing AIDS crisis. I mean, AIDS didn't go away in 1989 by any stretch. It's still a factor in what's going on in the community in the early 90s. And we see just a raft of Kansas City activism during that period. So I hope you'll join us next week. Same time, same channel. Thank you for coming.